Welcome to our live session where we'll be talking about turning technical APIs into business assets. So, we'll be talking about moving from endpoints to ecosystems, or in other words, we'll show you how to stop managing code and start driving growth. My name is Kay James. I'm a technical product marketing manager from Gravitee, and I'm joined by my colleague Faraz. Why don't you introduce yourself, Faraz?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's good to see everyone. My name is Faraz. I lead our solutions architecture teams here at Gravity. And I'm super excited to jump into our webinar today.
Awesome. So if we go to the next slide, just Faraz is going to give us a demo later on in our session here. But before we get to that, I'll open up with a story of the Monday morning crisis, which should illustrate the need for API management. And at the end, we are going to do a Q&A as well. So if you have any questions along the way, just drop them in the question box on the right hand side, I think, of the screen. But without further ado, we will get to it. So, the Monday morning crisis. This story is actually probably a reality for a lot of you because it is Monday. Um, so, you can imagine it's a Monday morning and you are having your weekly syncs, you're catching up on what needs to be done this week, and your VP of sales drops by and has some great news for you. There's a potential partner who wants to integrate with your data today. And you guys, after celebrating with a coffee break, you actually start to think about this for a second. Um, it's great. Yes, you have the API, it exists, and your engineers built it months ago. So that's there. But now it's time to sell it, and you realize that you don't actually have the ability to see who's using the API. There's not an easy way for someone to sign up without a 2 week Jira ticket dance. And then you also have no idea if the API can handle the extra load. So you end up not having a product, but a collection of loose wires. And this
Mm,
is where your technical success meets business stagnation, right? And this illustrates some hidden costs. The hidden cost of untangling this collection of loose wires, um, not just financially, but also in terms of like actual labor, 100 plus hours lost every week in developer productivity due to manual discovery, redundant builds, and broken collaboration. And of course, the financial end of it, 10,000, upwards of $10,000 every week lost in revenue from delayed partner onboarding and friction around accessing, right? So these costs and these problems, it's not just RESTful APIs, it's also our event-driven APIs, and then in turn our AI initiatives because agents and MCP tools they rely on APIs. So if there's not really a good way to organize and secure all of this, we are just not in a good situation, right? So we need some kind of tool or something that's going to help us achieve the things that we want to do as a business. According to Forrester Research, they found that enterprises that productize and strategically manage their APIs see up to 50% faster time to market. And basically, if we can move faster, we'd be able to wipe out those hidden costs that I mentioned earlier. So API management, productization, these are the things that is going to help us have a better time to be able to make our VP of sales happy and make our partners happy and make the business happy instead of managing loose wires, instead of managing endpoints, you could be managing an ecosystem. So Faraz is going to take us through API management. Go ahead, Faraz.
All right, let's jump right into I think why everyone is here after getting that really good introduction from Kay. So thank you so much for that, Kay. That's going to be really good context for essentially what exactly is going to go into our API management lifecycle. So the very beginning of the we're going to call it the storm here because this really is going to be a storm. We're going to bring up a lot of different ways to manage your APIs, but at the very beginning, you need to look at what exactly can I do to build value for my APIs. That's the number one thing that we have to solve is what type of value can we extract from these APIs? What's the business use case? What exactly are we trying to solve for? And then you can go and do everything, right? In terms of proper API management, API to expose it, to design it. But at the core, when we talk about API management, I want to really look at the pronoun before that, right? Proper API management. Because anyone can do API management. My grandma can do API management. It doesn't mean it's good API management. Proper API management is going to look at the process of actually following and adhering to that design process, right? So designing your APIs, creating them and publishing them, using the industry standard OAS spec with your APIs, controlling their policies, managing the actual access control, who gets to access the API, nurturing the subscriber community. In other words, giving access to your API to different external users, and then of course, last and not least, collecting and analyzing usage statistics is massive, super, super, super important here as well. So that is exactly our API management lifecycle. And to go a little bit in depth here, to talk about the first two, so designing and securing slash exposing and controlling access. You want to be able to use an API management company to, yes, help you with the actual design of your APIs. These should not be technical folks. These should be non-technical folks. These should be folks that come into your API management tool and they know exactly how to, let's say, describe all the different routes and paths and endpoints without actually having to put hands on keyboard. And that's what Gravitee is mainly around to help you do, right? In terms of designing APIs. Number two, securing. Once you've actually created your API, you've got the structure of it, and your development team, your engineers are actually coding it. You have to figure out what type of authentication are you going to use to then go and actually secure that API and expose it, and then of course control the access. So is it OAuth? Is it JWT authentication? Is it MTLS? Is it API keys? There's everything under the sun to choose from. But the point is that we need to secure the API. And then also, because we secured it, we have to choose who gets to access it, control the actual access of our API. Number three, and number three out of our four kind of step life cycle here is documenting, discovering, and consuming. So this is where your developer portal is going to be extremely, extremely important because number one, you want to make sure that you can at least, and I think most importantly, be able to say that this API is going to live somewhere for, let's say, Kay's team to go and access it. And then, of course, you have to be able to actually subscribe to it. I did a talk in San Francisco at API World about 6 months ago, and I asked a question. And the question was, how many people in the audience um, have trouble accessing your organization's APIs? And like 90% of the room put their hand up. And then I asked them, how many of you folks still give access through email, like for your APIs? And literally every one of those hands that were up stayed up. And then, and I bet you it's very common as well, right? For the folks that are attending this webinar, it's probably still common. You still see it today where we're sharing Postman collections or Swagger Hub collections over email. So this is exactly what we're trying to solve. And the biggest, most important thing is that we can do this part with ease. The last thing is after we've designed our APIs, controlled who gets to access them, and been able to now expose them, discover them, and consume them, we now have our monitor and analyze, right? Our monitor and analyze is going to allow us to observe our APIs, to be able to look into what exactly is the trends with this API. How is, let's say, how is Kay using this API? How often is she using it? And kind of information like that. You want to be able to track all of that information. So let's get into the slides here right before we jump into a demo, and I'll jump right into the actual product and walk you guys through, the goal for today's session. But before that, I want you to kind of put into your head what we're actually going to be doing here, and it's going to cap onto the idea of building value right from your APIs, and then giving a platform where it doesn't matter who you are, right? You could be extremely technical or not technical at all and be someone that just wants to extract some level of um, value in terms of business from those APIs. So think of product engineers and product managers, product owners, all the way to your platform engineers and software engineers, and your very kind of deep DevOps engineers in your company. All of them should be able to extract the same value. And what we have here is the ability to look at, for example, in our demo, we're going to be designing our API. We are going to be productizing that API, right? From a vanilla API to an actual business asset. We're then going to jump into our second, um, we can say we call it phase in our life cycle, right? Which is the secure and control. And that's where we're going to actually protect our API using API key authentication. And then, of course, we're going to allow who gets to access the API and then expose it, give access to it, subscribe, and monitor all of that available to us. So before we jump into this, I will say if anyone has any questions whatsoever, Kay can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you can just go ahead and pop them into the Q&A box. You can ask your questions in the chat, whatever works. I have a tendency to ramble and ramble and ramble, and I sometimes need someone to tell me to be quiet. So a question will tell me to be quiet, I promise you. Um, well, that's actually
You're good, bro. Just
that's
keep
the exact
going.
opposite, isn't it? All right, let's go ahead and just kind of rock and roll here. So this is the Gravitee platform. And the Gravitee platform is going to give all of you guys the ability to do, we'll do a couple of things. Number one, manage your APIs, design them, create them. And then your second two phases, which is the actual exposing, consumption, analytics, all that fun stuff. So when we talk about your analytics, right off the bat, your aggregated analytics, we want to go into an API right off the bat, and we want to create, let's say, if I go into one of my APIs here, let's call it the Twitter API. We want to be able to go into our API traffic and monitor how exactly is this API being consumed? How is it acting? How is it working? And then here, I can go deeper into these logs, right? I can click into logs and I can see on a very, very, very specific honed down level all those individual payload logs that I might want to consume. So this is our third kind of stage here, right? If I was to go and create a quick API immediately, like let's just go ahead and build this, that we'll design it. We'll actually design all different endpoints and things like that. We'll follow the full process here. So API name. Let's go ahead and call this K's API. And K's API is going to, let's think of K's API like one business unit at the organization. And essentially, we want to make sure that K and her API and her group of APIs are going to be able to be accessed the same way. So that's our name. And our version, we can go ahead and version directly out of the box here. So think of that API lifecycle that we just finished talking about and being able to do all of those different characteristics in there, right? The second thing that we want to do quickly before we cap this part off is just give it a description, right? That way, folks that are accessing this API on your developer portal following that last stage or phase of the API lifecycle can actually know, right, about this API and who's this API targeting, what is it about, what's the business value that you want to extract out of this API. You can put that in there. So the business value here is success. There you go. There's a Michael Scott quote for everyone. Now, let's go ahead and choose our REST API. So that's the focus of today's game. It's how do we turn your REST APIs, your APIs into scalable business assets. So if I go and choose our HTTP proxy, keep in mind, you can manage your APIs over TCP as well. But this is ultimately where, and anyone can do this part. That's the most important part that I want to show to you guys. Anyone can do the steps that I'm doing now. You don't have to be a platform engineer or a product owner. As long as you have an idea or an OAS spec available to you, then this part is going to be extremely, extremely easy. So for our entry points, this is how are your users or your developers actually accessing your API on the gateway? How are we loading this API on your gateway? And so we can call this our Twitter, let's say Twitter user API. It's a long name, but I'm going to give you the idea of how we're basically going to build, let's say, a Twitter application using Gravitee. So this is our Twitter user API. And if I click validate, the only other thing that I need to do here before this API is done in Gravity is give it an endpoint. So if entry point was how are my users accessing the API in Gravity, my endpoint is how is Gravity accessing my API, right? Since we talked about that concept of a reverse proxy. So here, I want to take the actual URL of my API. So this is the user's API. As you can see here, this is a real API that exists out there. You can go ahead and pass things like user number one, and we can get information about one specific user. There's a second user, and it's meant to mimic pretty much how we can build a Twitter application, right? Because every user will then have posts, and then every post for every user like will have comments. So think of the idea of, let's say someone comes to you and says, hey, I want you to go and build a Twitter application. And you come into Gravity and your goal is to now go ahead and do that. So let's take this API, and what we're going to do is we'll add the users endpoint, and then we'll click validate, validate, and deploy. So I told you guys it would take 30 seconds to build our API. Now, albeit I kind of talked a little bit here, but that's really it. I mean, literally, we have a working API now in Gravity. And for us to actually go and proxy this API is if I copy this, let's go into my endpoints and go right over the browser. I'm not even going to put this into Postman or anything like that. But you guys see that here, I'm accessing the API directly. And instead, I'm hitting the users for endpoint one. So in my case, I can do the same thing, except I messed up something in my endpoint. And what's a demo without something breaking, obviously? So let's go and fix that, deploy, and go back into my entry point. And there it is. Okay. So now we can go and pop in our users for endpoint one. And that's perfect. It works perfectly. So the goal here is to show you guys that I have two types of essentially APIs. I have my direct API and then I have my Gravity API. And it's accessing the same thing. So really, we're not actually doing anything significant so far, but we do have an API that we're managing in Gravity. Now let's actually make this pretty dang significant. So I'll go ahead and publish this API on our developer portal. I'll make it public so that anyone can access it. And now that we've designed our API, we'll actually create the building blocks to protect it, to secure it before we go and give access to it. So that third stage in the life cycle that we just talked about. So let me go into our policies, or sorry, our consumers rather, and add a security policy or security plan. So here you have access to pretty much every method of authentication under the sun with Gravity, right? We talked about MTLS, we talked about OAuth, JWTs, we talked about API keys, where we might want Gravity to actually go and manage our security for us. So here, if we simply give this a quick name, like let's say, for example, we can call this our gold API key plan. And we'll even put parentheses and say for external users. Okay. Now we can auto validate our subscriptions, which just basically says that if someone subscribes to this, we don't need to go and approve it manually. We'll just let it approve itself. Click next, next, and create. And that's it. Let's just go ahead and publish this plan. So now we have two types of plans. We have one, which is a default keyless, and we have two, which is a gold API key plan. So if I was to go into my policies now, as part of our design phase, we want to make sure that we build value out of this API. It's all going to come together when we actually go and access it. But hopefully you guys are following along. And again, if you do have questions, pop them into the chat. And Kay will just let me know if there's something that I can answer. So we have two policies here, or two plans that we can add our policies on. So not to confuse anyone, we're going to take this really slowly. We have a keyless plan, meaning if you don't pass in any security whatsoever, you can access this API. And you can also access the API if you add in security. So we want to legitimize this API, right? As a business asset, we want to make sure that the majority of users that access this API are not going to get full access. So we can even call this partial access. This flow is for partial access. And if you're going to access the API without any API key or token, then we want you to be limited by this API. So let's go and look at the Policy Studio here. I would need an extra 7 hours in this webinar to just simply get through the rest of these policies. So I'm not going to explain every single one of them, but what I am going to do is explain the most important one for our demo here, which is the resource filtering policy. Now, what that's going to do is it's actually going to allow us to specify a specific path that we are going to either give access to or deny access to. So you see here that I'm able to access the user's one path. Let's say, before I actually go and create this, let's say if you're not going to pass in authentication, you should only be able to access the user's one. If you want to access the rest of the API, like users two or users two posts, you have to pass an authentication. We're going to do all of that in like 7 letters. So we're going to do a whitelist. And in the whitelist, we're just simply going to add in the user's one path. That's it. Meaning on this free plan, right? This free partial access plan, you're going to be limited by only being given access to this path or this endpoint. Everything else is going to be deny listed. So we'll save this and we'll actually go and test this out. So what I want to do is I want to refresh on the users /1, and that works. Now, what happens if I go to users /2? There is now a policy that Gravitee is telling me saying, you're not allowed to access this API. And the reason I can't access it is because remember, I'm trying to access a path that isn't allowed to me. And the way that I can access the rest of this API is now by subscribing to it. So one really good example of this is everyone on this webinar is aware of ChatGPT. And one thing that ChatGPT does really well is they give you access to a small subset of that API, right? The same way that we're giving you a small subset of access to this API. And then they're saying, if you want to use the rest of this API or use more tokens or use a more sophisticated LLM, you have to pay us. And you, as product owners or as API owners, can do the same thing with Gravitee, right? You can access this API, but if you want to access more of it, you have to pay us. So Gravitee is enabling us exactly in that sense. So let's go actually in our developer portal. And what we're going to do is go and subscribe to this API. So there's K's API. And if I click into this API, you can see that there's no information whatsoever about this API. And this is our developer portal, right? This is where we're actually subscribing to and publishing APIs and consuming them. So what I want to do is actually add some information here and ultimately make sure that this API is going to be in a place where my consumers know exactly how to or what they're subscribing to. So if I just go to my documentation here and I create a new page, let's say this is Markdown, and I can click next. I can fill in the markdown myself. My markdown is not the best, but we can go in and just say, getting started. Here is how you access this API. Step 2 is have fun. Okay, and you can save and publish this. And then we might want to add some actual documentation for you to learn how to use your API. So let's just go into Pet Store Swagger and we'll copy their OAS spec here. You can use literally any OAS spec if you'd like. You could even use, your own preferably. But we're just simply going to add that open API page there. And we're going to call this OAS spec and click next. Now, there's a bunch of different ways for us to bring in their documentation. And one really cool way that we see enterprises do all the time, especially if you wanted to just automate this and kind of let it manage itself, is link this to some external source, some CI/CD process that you might be working with today. So Bitbucket or GitHub repos or however way you're versioning all this stuff. Again, because we're talking to both technical and non-technical audience here, you can 100% make this so that it is a set it and forget it. And all you have to do is maintain your documentation in your existing repositories today. So I'm talking to all those product managers and owners and developers who work really, really well with OAS spec. You can continue to manage your OAS spec, and everything else will kind of figure itself out in Gravitee. You just have to set it up. So there's our OAS spec, save and publish, and we're now ready to rock and roll. So if I go and refresh our page just by proxy of doing what we just did, those 2 pages right there, here's our getting started. Very basic markdown. We could probably make this much more sophisticated, but it gives you an idea of the art of the possible, right? You could do tables, you could add images and videos and embedded links. If you go all the way to documentation, you're going to get a beautiful rendered OAS spec directly in your developer portal here. So think of now that process of documenting, right, in the API lifecycle. Documenting is extremely, extremely important, right? Because that's what's going to make sure that you, as API owners, as product owners, as platform engineers, API developers, you're making sure that you have some central catalog to not only publish all of your APIs, but also make sure that your consumers can read about them, right? You have to find a place to put them, but you want your consumers to find a place to access them. So that's exactly what we're going to do right now. So we have 2 plans for K's API, which is our Twitter application, right? That we're managing through Gravitee. And you have 2 ways to access this API. One way is the default keyless, which we've actually done already, right? We can access this endpoint, um, the user's one, but we can't access any other path because we're not passing in authentication. So if I go in and choose our gold API plan, we can use this existing application. So Gravitee has the concept of applications for every one of your consumer. And that's what's giving your users the ability to say, oh, here's an API. I can use this application that maybe me and Kay and a couple of other colleagues are sharing. And we're using that to access your APIs. So one shared set of credentials for all of your services. Super, super, super useful, and very good for larger organizations, smaller organizations, everything in between. You want to make sure that you manage all of that in some facade. So here we can say, comment to our API owners like, we can't wait to use your cool Twitter API. And I think it's called X now. Who knows what's going to happen to me now that I called it Twitter? But what we're going to do is copy that API key. That's it. So your users, when they go and access your API in Gravitee, think about this whole concept, right? Is they're coming in, they have no idea how to actually consume or request access. I asked you guys the question in the beginning of how many people share access over email. Your consumers are coming into this API and you don't know who they are. They could be random external developers or internal folks in your organization. They read about your API. They look at the documentation. They try it out, your API, maybe using mock testing and things like that. But ultimately, they're ready to go and subscribe to it. And you've given them an option of, well, many different options for how to access that API. And within your subscriptions, we're simply, if I just go into copy my URL, Gravitee is going to give me my API key for accessing this API, and then also how exactly, like literally how to call this API. So if I simply, let me go and actually bring in a terminal here, and I'll make this a bit bigger for you guys. And I will paste our command now. So this is the command that Gravitee gave me. It's just a curl command, right? And the curl command is passing in a header, and that header is including an API key, which is exactly the same API key that Gravitee gave me. And there's the URL for my API. So we want to pass in, remember, the users /1. That's the one that we can access, right? If I hit this, it works. And remember, if you don't pass in authentication, that should work as well. So what I want to do is I want to test this. I want to test this by hitting our endpoint 2. And we'll click next, we'll hit next, and that worked, right? So our curl command worked as expected, even though if I was to remove my API key, let's literally remove this header altogether and try and curl, you can see that we're getting a 403. And that's because we set it up in Gravitee so that if you're not passing in any access, any authentication, you're going to be barred from accessing 99% of this API. But if you pass in authentication like we do here. There's our header, and pass this in, you can see that we're able to access that same endpoint that we were blocked from accessing. Now we can take this so many levels further. Fortunately, for just for the sake of time, we're not going to be able to, but we will definitely have another webinar in, I believe, in very soon, where we could go and capitalize on all of this. However, we can do some pretty cool things really quickly here before we jump back to our slides and just kind of recap what we did here. Is we want to add some more kind of policies. And we can add a default policy for everyone that accesses your API within the API key authentication. So think of now, right, in terms of your business asset, you have a lot of users that are accessing your free API. And that's great, right? We know that giving some level of free access is good. And you now have your paid portion of your API. Within the paid portion of your API, how do we know that for us should have different level of control or access than K, for example? Well, we don't, because we're treating both for us and K as the exact same when someone subscribes to this API. Well, maybe that's wrong. Maybe I want K to have way more access to this API and I want for us to have access to one endpoint. That's all done through our policies here in terms of our flows. So I actually did that. Well, we did this without even realizing what we did. Is this flow is basically saying for every single person that accesses this API using the gold plan, we're going to give you access and limits based off of what we've defined here, which we've defined nothing. So let's go and define something here. Let's do a rate limit of, let's say, 2 requests per 60 seconds. So you can, even if you can access the rest of this API, you're going to be limited to 2 requests per 60 seconds. So if I go back to my API, and what I'm actually going to do is open up Postman for this just to show you guys. It's super, super, super clean to look at. I think we're done with our developer hats. Let's bring in our lovely Postman here. So there's our API. And again, if I don't pass an authentication, we're going to get that error message. You're not allowed to access this API. So if we do add our authentication, so X Gravitee API key, and I go over and I grab our key, probably copy it from our developer portal. It's easier, but there it is. So we should now expect to get a 200 for passing in our authentication. There's our 200. But remember, using our API key plan, we should only be able to access it twice in 1 minute based off that policy that we just made. And now we're getting hit with that exact message that we were expecting, which is, hey, you're being rate limited. And in the next 60 seconds, you will be able to access this API. So that is 90% of our API lifecycle. The last bit is, and I would even argue one of the most important bits, is the ability for you to actually monitor and observe your API. There's a couple of ways that we want to make sure we do this, right? So within your application, as a consumer, you want to be able to go into your application and see your individual analytics. So this is your consumers. They can go in, they can see exactly. So here's a 429. I can see there was no headers logged here, and that's probably because I did not actually pass anything. But if I go to, let's say, another request, let's go to this one. Yeah, I get another one. We'll make some more requests and actually pass in some headers. But the whole idea is your consumers can actually see all of these analytics, and by clicking into them, they will be able to see headers and body if you are, of course, passing all of that. So that is the consumer perspective. Now, what about the admin or the owners, right? Your product owners or anyone, again, that's concerned with any type of business value from your APIs. So by going into your API traffic, right, this is where we're going to see our total requests. So we literally made this API during this presentation. And you can see here, we've had so far a total of 17 requests. You can see the different paths that we tried to access here. So remember, as you're building your Twitter application, you might have users, you might have posts, you might have on top of that like comments or I think they're called tweets. I'm actually not on Twitter, so I'm not actually sure about this, but all of that is managed directly in Gravity in terms of what's the most popular endpoints here. What are the most popular responses? What are your most popular plans? Who exactly is accessing your keyless path? Who's accessing your API key plan? That is extremely important, right? If you wanted to know who's using the free portion of your API or who's actually paying for access. And then, of course, if you wanted to be more verbose here, you can click right into your logs. Within your logs, you can jump directly into one of these, let's say, issues, and you can see exactly what the 429 is for, right? Gravity is telling me, hey, the reason for this is because you've had way too many issues with your rate limits here. And if I was to go back in, and let's say I wanted to look at, for example, a 200 here. We can open up the details. We can see exactly what path they tried to access. And because I was accessing that users too without any actual authentication, we are not going to get that full payload response. However, let's go and log all of this. And by log all of it, I'm saying I want to be as verbose as absolutely possible. In other words, I want to make sure every single thing, every part of this API is being processed, logged, and recorded. So now, if I go and make two more requests here with our API, and you can see that we were now rate limit exceeded. If I even remove this header, you can see that we're getting now our 403. If I try and access the first endpoint, I will get a 200, and we can make as many 200s as we want here. So a lot of requests. And if I go into my logs now, you can see 1637, we have our 200, we have our 429. Let's go into our 200 here, and you can see way more detail that essentially Gravity is capturing. So Gravity is basically saying, hey, you made a request to this API. We're going to tell you everything that you possibly need to know about this. So, for example, on the request side, what's the actual agent that you're using? Postman, well, let me make this a bit bigger for you guys. But Postman, in my case, if you go down, you can see exactly the response headers from the actual backend. You can see the body, the raw request, and the raw response payloads. Everything is 100% available to you here. And of course, it's also available to you in the application level as a consumer, as a user. So if I was to open up these 200s, you can see that my headers are being captured here. And so is my body, headers, and body response, all for your consumers so that they can see every single part of this API in terms of what exactly do they care about? What's the most important thing for them to see? So that is our demo here so far. We went through the entire kind of life cycle. And so what I'll do is I'll just recap here in terms of our demo, what we saw. And again, any questions whatsoever, please bring them up into the chats or the Q&A chat. We'll be sure to answer those at the end. But what we have here is essentially a full kind of idea or demo of the Gravity API Management Console. So we saw, after looking at the entire API lifecycle and looking at all 5 phases, how we can successfully accomplish all of that in the Gravity platform. So all the way from design to securing, um, making sure that even within the secured plans, we have access controls. So they're our third phase to exposing the API and documenting it with OES spec. That's our fourth phase. And then making sure that we're consuming our analytics and traffic and observability. We're extremely aware of what exactly is going in that API, what's coming out of that API, and literally everything in between. That's the absolute most way that you're going to be verbose about your API, and that you as product owners, product managers, developers, SRE, DevOps, API owners, all the way to our CTOs and everything in between, that's how you're going to be able to 100% be confident about building your APIs and then extracting business value. Otherwise, your API is just something that talks to a database. And we can be much, much more useful out of our APIs following this life cycle here. So that is our successful completion of our demo here. I'm going to remove the screen share and anything that we have remaining here. Okay, I'll put it in your hands and you let me know where you need me.
All right, awesome, Faraz. Thank you so much for the demo and the explanation. I hope that everybody, has a better idea now of how we go from managing endpoints to managing an ecosystem and productizing our APIs. Um, I guess we would go over now to our question and answer portion. If you have any questions, please submit them now. I do have some that I wrote down because I find this topic very interesting. So for Ross, my question is: if you have like 100 APIs, or say my team just has there's more than one team, everybody has a lot going on, right?
Yeah.
How do we how would we be able to do this without needing to refactor everything at once?
That's a really good question, Kay. So your question is essentially all of our APIs, right? Let's say 100 or 200 APIs. How do we make sure that we version and publish, maintain those APIs without changing the actual code itself, without changing or refactoring everything at the same time? It's a great question. So when you're using a platform or a tool, the most important thing about that tool is, well, two things in my opinion. A, that tool has to make your life easier for the job that you're asking that tool to do. In other words, manage your APIs. And number two, that tool should not change your existing processes if let's say if those processes should not be changed. Sometimes it's better to change your processes. We talk to customers all the time about just making things better. But if you have a CI/CD pipeline and that tool can't support a certain CI/CD pipeline, you got to get rid of that tool. And with Gravitee, the way that we're very opinionated about this is if you have right now a way that you might want to version your APIs or promote your APIs or manage them or even bulk import them, we can support that. So if you're in like Kubernetes, if you're managing everything through Docker and REST APIs, and however way really you're looking at bringing in your APIs from one repository to another, from one lower environment to a higher environment, we can support that. So does that answer your question, Kay?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, I have another question. If let's say that my team doesn't really sell our APIs externally, it's mostly like an internal use case between teams internally.
Mhm.
Does productization still apply in that type of use case?
So the answer is 100%, 100% yes. Um, when we talk about productization, we're basically saying with any one of your APIs, and really the reason that you're building your APIs is to extract some value out of that API, even if it is a service to service API or an API that's like ChatGPT's APIs, consumers are actually accessing. No matter what, it has to have some value. So when we talk about API productization, and the reason that this demo is super relevant to everyone that does not even need to be technical, is because we want you to see that regardless of what the use case is for that API, we have to be able to sit down and say, what is the underlying business value for this API or for this service? Is it a Twitter application? But why? Is it because we have all these consumers that we just have to make sure have access to our data? But why? It's always that why, right? And that tool that we're using has to be able to support the answers to the whys, right? Oh, we have all these different consumers. Okay, perfect. We can segregate access. Oh, we have two different reasons for building business value. Perfect. We can actually build that value directly in our policies. Um, what some of our value might be to literally for internal APIs. To your question, Kay, we might want to make sure that these APIs are only accessible within our company or organization. We're doing too much of that sharing APIs over emails. Perfect. Gravitee can make sure we absolutely support having all of your documentation, all of your APIs, all of your keys, security in one place. So it really depends on what the question is that we're answering. But underlyingly, at the core, every single API should be productized, regardless if it's internal or external, or whatever it is. But yeah, that's a great question.
So I think we can wrap up our webinar here. Thank you so much for us for for your demo and walking us through Gravity API management. I think that's all from us. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you guys. Appreciate it. Thanks, Kay. You're a rock star. See you,
All right.
everyone.
Bye bye.